So, hello, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to this short introduction, about half an hour, on tonight's opera. My name's Matthew Gardner. I'm a professor. I'm from England originally, but I'm a professor at the Hochschule für Künste in Bremen. And very happy to give you a short introduction this evening. So, Deidamia, the last of Handel's 37 Italian operas for London. The first performance was on the 10th of January 1741, and as usual for Handel's London theatre works, it was advertised in the newspapers, as you can see here in the London Daily Post and General Advertiser. The performance was given at the Theatre Royal in Lincoln's Inn Fields, no longer there today, the theatre at least, and in contrast to the majority of Handel's opera librettos, which are usually adaptations of pre-existing Italian librettos, this was based on a new libretto, newly written by the Italian librettist working in London, the Italian poet and librettist Paolo Antonio Roli, who had been in London since about 1715 and who had previously provided 4 Italian opera librettos for Handel, as well as the libretto for Muzio Scevola in 1721, for which Handel, Giovanni Bononcini and Attilio Ariosti composed the music for 1 act each. The story of Deidamia had already proved popular with opera composers and was usually known under the name of the leading male role, Achille. Metastasio's Achille Eschiro, for example, had recently been set to music by Antonio Caldara in 1736 and had received its first performance in Vienna. The plot revolves around the Greek hero Achilles, who was sent to the Isle of Skyros by his mother in an attempt to prevent him dying in the Trojan War. The crux of the plot centers on the fact that Achilles is in disguise as a young girl, Pyrrha, but the princess Deidamia has discovered his true identity, and they have become lovers. Ulysses, disguised as Nestor's son, Antilochus, Nestor himself a silent character, and the Greek ambassador Phoenice arrive in Skyros to find Achilles. Lycomedes remains faithful to a promise given to Achilles' father and tells them that Achilles is no longer on the island. Achilles, in disguise as Pyrrha, displays his prowess in the hunt, which leads Deidamia's companion, Nerea, to question who he really is. How could a little girl be good at hunting? The disguised Ulysses, somebody else in disguise, pays court to Deidamia, which makes Achilles jealous. Lycomedes then orders a royal hunt, during which Achilles, still as Pyrrha, reveals his identity through his skill to the Greeks. Ulysses and Phoenice both make overtures to Pyrrha, who appears to enjoy being flattered, and Deidamia becomes fearful of losing her lover. Phoenice declares that he has fallen in love with Nerea. Ulysses tricks Achilles, still in disguise as Pyrrha, by offering him a choice of gifts: fine silks and ornaments, or a shield, helmet, and sword. Achilles, or rather Pyrrha, chooses the latter, and thus reveals himself. Ulysses calls for heroes to defend Greece. Achilles immediately dispenses with his disguise and declares himself ready for war, leaving Deidamia distraught. She turns to Ulysses for comfort, but he reveals his own identity and that he is faithful to his wife Penelope. Achilles' valor impresses Ulysses, who as a reward marries the lovers before the Greeks depart, thus facilitating the lieto fine, or happy end. Every Italian opera ends happily, more or less. The libretto was, as usual for Handel's operas, printed with an anonymous English translation on facing pages and was available in advance of the performances. And if any of you are interested in these, a lot of them are online. You can download them at home and read through the original 18th century translation. Sometimes it's very good, sometimes it's not a very good translation. It depends who did it and depends on the libretto a little bit. The music was composed by Handel in autumn 1740. And here you can see the first page of the score in Handel's own handwriting, known as an autograph score. Luckily for us today, from the 1730s onwards, Händel began documenting his progress during the composition of operas and oratorios by dating the completion of each act. In the case of Deidamia, he noted in German that he had started work on the opera on the 27th of October 1740. He'd got to the end of Act 1 a few days later on the 1st of November. Act 2 was complete on the 7th of November. He then took about a week off from Deidamia, noting that he started work on Act 3 on the 14th of November, and he had completed the opera 6 days later on the 20th of November. While this may seem quick by today's standards, Händel usually composed an opera or oratorio in around about a month. During the process of composition, he made several corrections and adjustments, as was also common, before a clean performing score was copied by his assistant, Christopher Smith, who along with a team of copyists would have also copied the music for the orchestral players, now lost. So on the left you can see Händel's handwriting, the autograph, and on the right hand side the neat copy produced by Christopher Smith, which would have been on the harpsichord at the first performance in 1741. Deidamia was only performed 3 times, the third of which was at the Little Theatre in the Haymarket rather than the Theatre Royal at Lincoln's Inn Fields for unknown reasons, but as with most of Händel's operas, the arias were published shortly afterwards, after the first performance. And on here you can see on the left the arias, and on the other side, on the right, the overture was also published as a keyboard arrangement. Okay, so a few days after the first performance, you could buy all the arias to play yourself at home. There were no recordings in the 18th century. And then here, a collected volume a little bit later, where you could play all of Händel's overtures on the harpsichord at home. Wonderful arrangements, which sometimes you hear in concerts today. One reason for the comparatively small number of performances was that the opera was composed and produced at a time when Italian opera in London was going through a difficult phase, and when interest in Händel's English oratorios, which he had been offering alongside opera since 1732, were becoming increasingly popular. To understand the background to Deidamia, it is therefore important to consider Händel's theatre seasons in the lead up to 1741. Between the 1733-4 season and the 1736-7 seasons, Händel's opera company had been in fierce competition with a new company, commonly referred to as the Opera of the Nobility, and led by the castrato Senesino, who had previously worked with Händel and the composer Nicola Porpora. At the end of the 1736-7 season, after 4 seasons of intense rivalry, Händel's company, like the competition, collapsed, and the future of Italian opera in London faced uncertainty. During the final weeks of the season, Händel had been taken ill with a paralytic disorder or rheumatic palsy, probably some sort of stroke, which affected the use of his hands. However, before departing London for Aix-la-Chapelle to undertake spa treatment, he made an agreement to compose 2 new operas for the King's Theatre for the 1737-8 season when he got back. The 4 seasons that followed, and that led up to Händel's final performances of Italian opera in London with Deidamia, switched between opera and oratorio, largely depending on the availability of suitable Italian singers. So, in the 1737-8 season, Händel presented an almost entirely Italian season, the only exception being an oratorio, a benefit performance for Händel himself. 2 new operas, Faramondo and Circe, were contracted by the manager of the King's Theatre, John Jacob Heidegger, who was running the season, and Händel also offered a new pasticcio opera with Alessandro Severo. These were interspersed with operas by other composers and pasticcios. A decent cast of Italians was available for the season, almost all of whom were taken over from the nobility company, and Heidegger, the manager of the King's Theatre, had managed to recruit a new castrato, Caffarelli. His real name was Gaetano Maiano, and Caffarelli had arrived in the first half of October, and according to the Whitehall Evening Post was comparable to the renowned castrato Farinelli, who had sung for the Opera of the Nobility. The beginning of this week, Signor Caffarelli, a famous singer, arrived here from Italy. He has practiced the part he is to sing in the new opera and meets with a universal applause, the virtuosos in music being of opinions he sings as well as Farinello. In contrast, the 1738-9 season was a largely English season, but with a single performance of Il Trionfo del Tempo e della Verità on the 3rd of March, and towards the end of the season, Händel added a new pasticcio opera Giova in Argo. The latter was likely a reaction to the establishment of a new opera company at Covent Garden under the patronage of Lord Middlesex. Evidence for the reason Händel could not produce Italian opera for this season can be found in the London newspapers. Heidegger had failed to secure sufficient singers. And you can see here he says, and that I could not agree with the singers, though I offered 1,000 guineas to one of them. Not even 1,000 guineas was enough to tempt them to sing for Händel in this season. That brings us to 1739 to 40. This season was based at Lincoln's Inn Fields and was a wholly English season. While the newly established Middlesex Opera Company across the road offered a variety of Italian operas at the King's Theatre. For the 1740 to 41 season, Händel had sufficient singers to mount a season featuring 2 new Italian operas, Imeneo and Deidamia, followed by revivals of English works, and the Middlesex Opera Company was not operating, paving the way for Händel to run his final season of Italian operas. As you've probably guessed by now, the singers were at the centre of any opera production in London, and the difficulties of procuring suitable Italian singers was what led to the 1738 to 9 and 1740 to 41 seasons, focusing primarily or solely on English language works. It was, however, also what led to the complex compositional history of Imeneo, Handel's other new opera for the 1740 to 41 season, performed for the first time just a few weeks before Deidamia. Händel composed a first draft of Imeneo in September and October 1738, but it was not performed during the 1738 to 9 season, almost certainly owing to a lack of suitable Italian singers. Towards the end of the 1739 to 40 season, Händel revised the score, probably in the hope of performing it at the end of the season, but again, no performance took place. In 1740 to 41, with the arrival of a castrato, Händel could finally perform the opera following further adjustments. Händel's singers for the 1740 to 41 season and the cast of Deidamia as listed in the 1741 word book can be summarised as follows. The title role in Deidamia was given to the French soprano, Elizabeth de Parc, known under her stage name La Francesina. Having trained in Italy, she arrived in London in 1736 to sing with the opera of the nobility. Händel recruited her for his company in the 1737 to 8 season, and he created roles for her in his 3 new operas of that season, Faramando, Circe, and the pasticcio Alessandro Severo. She could perform competently in English and sang in the first performances of Saul, Israel in Egypt, and A Song for St. Cecilia's Day. She became Händel's leading soprano, succeeding Annostrato, who left London in 1738, and in the 1740s she almost exclusively worked for Händel. The second female character in the opera and Deidamia's confidante, Nerea, was assigned to the Italian soprano Maria Monza. This was Monza's first role for Händel, and the first performance of Deidamia was also her debut performance in London. The Daily Advertiser reported on the 15th of December 1740 that last week arrived Signora Monza, the celebrated Italian singer who is to perform in Mr. Händel's operas and oratorios this season. Reports such as this, informing the London opera audience about the arrival and sometimes recruitment progress of Italian singers, was quite common, and today forms a valuable source of information for tracing the whereabouts of singers before and during opera seasons. Monza had sung in operas in Venice, Breslau and Prague, but from 1735 she was based in Hamburg, where her father directed the opera company between July 1737 and April 1738. Her last season there was 1737 to 8, and her whereabouts after this are unknown, but it is plausible she remained in Hamburg. When or where Händel recruited her is not documented, but in the summer of 1740 he travelled to the continent. On the 19th of July 1740, John Robartes wrote to James Harris that Mr. Händel set out for Germany Thursday last, which was the 17th of July, in company with Goupil. Therefore have little hopes of his amendment. Although his initial destination was probably Aix-la-Chapelle, Aachen, to take the waters, on the 30th of August 1740, the Daily Gazetteer reported that he had left Aachen and was making his way to Berlin. There is no evidence that he ever went there. but there are reports that he was in Haarlem in the Netherlands in September. He arrived back in London on the 18th of September, as the Daily Gazetteer reported 2 days later on the 20th of September. It can be assumed that Händel recruited Maria Monza whilst travelling on the continent, but there is no evidence that he went to Hamburg or met her in person. The first description of her voice is documented by Mary Pendarves, writing to Anne Dews on the 21st of December 1740, which is probably based on a report from her friend Anne Dunellan rather than first-hand experience, as Pendarves was away in the country at the time. Mr. Händel has got a new singer from Italy. Her voice is between Cuzzoni's and Strada's, strong but not harsh, her person miserably bad, being very low and excessively crooked. Dunellan improves of her. She is not to sing on the stage till after Christmas, so I shall not lose her first performance. She also sang in revivals of L'Allegro, Acis and Galatea, and Saul during the season. Miss Edwards might have been Mary Edwards, daughter of the singer Thomas Edwards. She was also a newcomer to Handel's company for the season and was a protégée of the actress-singer Kitty Clive. She had originally trained as a dancer under Charles Levitz, but from 1737 she gradually took on more singing parts. In 1740 she was around 16 years old, and as Berta Jonkers has shown, her season with Händel marks her great career break. Her first appearance on the stage was on the 19th of November 1737 in the afterpiece The Burgomaster Tricked, and her first role for Händel was Clomira in Imeneo. She did not go with Händel to Dublin in 1742, but she did sing for him in the 1742-3 season upon his return to London, taking minor roles in Samson and Messiah. She later sang under her married name Monsine. Edwards was likely recommended to Händel by Clive, for whom Händel wrote several theatre songs. Contemporary reports of Edwards are not particularly favourable. After attending a performance of the opera, Elizabeth Robinson, for example, wrote to her sister on the 10th of February 1741, stating that the singers were vile. I can compare them to nothing that will not set your teeth on edge. A little English girl, the best, i.e. worst, and the true Britons in the upper gallery never fail of giving her more a national than a critical applause. And in December 1740, in anticipation of the first performance, Charles Jennens wrote to James Harris that he has a fine opera to come out on Saturday, 7 night, called Deidamia, which might perhaps have a tolerable success, but that it will be turned into a farce by Miss Edwards, a little girl representing Achilles. Händel's only castrato for the season was Giovanni Battista Andreoni. Like Monza and Edwards, he was new to Händel's company, but unlike Monza, he was not new to London. He had been recruited by the Middlesex Opera Company for the 1739-40 season, where he appeared in 3 operas. In 1740-41, the Middlesex Company did not operate, so he was free for Händel to recruit for his performances. In the 1741-2 season, he returned to the Middlesex Company. He was not given a title role in either of Händel's operas for the 1740-41 season, singing Trinto in Imeneo and Ulysses in Deidamia. Like Monza, he also performed in Händel's revivals of English oratorios. But he sang in Italian rather than English. Bilingual revivals of oratorios were quite common in the 1730s, owing to Italians not being able or wanting to sing in English. Following his departure from London, Andreoni worked in Florence in 1742-4 and in 1747-8 and moved around to various other Italian cities. Deidamia, like Imeneo, includes 2 bass roles. Having been given the title role in Imeneo, William Savage sang Fenice in Deidamia. He had been trained in the English church music tradition at St. Paul's Cathedral before being taught privately by Pepusch and Gimignani. By 1741, he had worked with Händel for 7 years, since 1734, and he sang Joas in Ethalia, followed by Oberto in Alcina in 1735. When Händel returned from Dublin, he sang in the 1742-3 season, but upon his admission as a gentleman of the Chapel Royal in 1744, he had to stop singing solo roles for Händel. Chapel Royal singers weren't allowed to sing on the opera stage. The final singer on the cast list is Henry Reinhold, who performs the role of Le Comédie. Reinhold had worked with Händel since 1736 when he performed in Atalanta. When Händel returned from Dublin, Reinhold continued his career with Händel and sang in every oratorio from 1743 up to and including the first performance of Theodora in March 1750. The one singer who was missing, which would explain for the slightly unusual constellation of two basses, was the tenor John Beard, who was not in London for the 1740-41 season. In Imeneo, Handel's other opera for the 1740-41 season, the title role was for a tenor in the 1738 and 1739 drafts, and no doubt intended for Beard, but in 1740 the part was altered to the bass voice for Savage. There are a few aspects of the cast of Deidamia that at first might appear unusual. Firstly, why was the title role given to La Francesina when a castrato was available? Secondly, why are there two roles for bass voice? And thirdly, why did Händel employ a 16-year-old girl with no substantial experience of Italian opera for what is traditionally the title role? The answer to all of these questions partly boils down to Händel balancing the availability of singers with the operas that he intended to perform. It is important to remember here that in contrast to performances of Händel operas today, where a suitable cast is selected to perform the music that Händel left, in the 18th century, Händel conceived his music with a specific cast in mind and frequently adapted the music for revivals when the cast changed. Types of alterations could include the number of solo arias, the technical difficulty of the music, transpositions for different voice ranges or types, as well as changes to types of arias to fit the specialism of characters of individual singers. In the case of Deidamia, which as far as is known was a new libretto by Rowley rather than an adaptation of pre-existing texts, and which was composed by Händel when he would already have known who most of the cast were, the libretto and music could be tailored to fit the singers. Giving the title role to La Francesina as Deidamia rather than Achille, as is the case in various other librettos that are based on the story, is likely an example of Händel making good use of his leading soprano, who he had worked with for several seasons, as well as distributing the singers in the best possible way. He only had one castrato for the season, but two roles, Achille and Ulysses, that would normally be assigned to a castrato. As the story requires Achilles to be disguised as a young girl, the idea of giving the part to an actual young girl rather than a castrato in disguise and tailoring the libretto accordingly seems like a good pragmatic solution, especially as Ulysses is the stronger male role and therefore fitting for one of the castratos available. If Andreoni had sung Achilles, who would have sung Ulysses? One could ask, why did Händel not just hire another castrato? But as the long compositional history of Imeneo shows, acquiring Italian singers during this period proved difficult for Händel. The financial consideration should probably also not be forgotten. Edwards was doubtless cheaper than hiring a second castrato for the season. That there are two bass roles and no tenor role in the opera can be attributed to Beard being out of London, and Händel having two basses with experience of Italian opera and with whom he had previously worked. Rowley and Händel adapted the story to fit the cast by making the tension between Deidamia and Ulysses central rather than the relationship between Deidamia and Achilles. Casting Edwards as Achilles also follows a long tradition of Händel assigning female roles to the roles of military men stretching back as far as his first opera for London, Rinaldo in 1711, with 12 such cases across Händel's London career. As mentioned earlier, Händel frequently made changes to his operas and oratorios to fit the available cast. Sometimes alterations were made at the autograph stage, if unexpected changes to the cast occurred, or if a new singer's voice was slightly different than anticipated. Changes for revivals are generally recorded in Händel's performing scores, today almost all of which are held at the State and University Library in Hamburg. In the case of Deidamia, there were no revivals in later seasons. However, both the autograph and performing score include evidence of modifications that were made for the singer Maria Monza. Händel replaced 3 of her 6 arias and altered a 4th. In the past, it has been suggested that Händel composed the music with a less capable singer in mind. The music is indeed more technically demanding, with an expanded compass to 2 octaves, B to B2, and all 3 of the new arias are longer than the earlier settings. However, an alternative possibility is that Handel was not sufficiently acquainted with Monza's voice when he composed the opera and perhaps underestimated her capabilities. As mentioned earlier, Handel began composing on the 27th of October. The date is recorded at the end of the overture, and the opera was complete on the 20th of November. And on Thursday the 15th of December, it was reported that Monza had arrived in London the previous week, so she was not yet in London when Handel completed the autograph score of Deidamia. The earlier versions of the arias were copied into the performing score and then replaced, which suggests that the changes to her part were made at a later stage, perhaps after some of the first rehearsals. The autograph contains both the new and the old version of the arias. The new versions were inserted in front of the rejected versions, here for example number 6. It is therefore possible to examine the changes Handel made. The performing score only includes the new versions today, but evidence that the older versions were present remains. Here, for example, it is visible where the earlier setting of number 34 has been removed and replaced with the music. The first 6 bars of the earlier version remain. This aria is found at the end of Act 1, Scene 2, where Nerea comments on Pyrrha's, Achilles in disguise, dislike of female tasks and her unnatural interest in war. As was typical for 18th century Italian opera, the arias, which primarily express the emotions of the characters, are in da capo form, meaning they are made up of 2 contrasting parts, an A part and a B part, with a repeat of the A section after the B section. Handel makes Monza's aria technically more demanding, particularly in the B section, where he employs longer coloratures with leaps of up to 2.5 octaves, an octave and a fifth, here on the right. Much more challenging than the sequential line with a maximum leap of a sixth in the earlier version on the left. As with much of the music Handel rejected before the first performance of his theatre works, the earlier versions of the arias have not been commercially recorded and are never performed. But we can listen to the B section of the new version, which is what you're going to hear tonight. So just a few bars here, this long, difficult section here, so you can see just how much more difficult Handel made it when you compare it to the short red section on the left. Okay, so what probably happened here was the singer arrived in London, Handel realized she was more competent than he first thought, and made the aria more technically difficult. It also has the advantage that the character becomes more teasing and fits the role better. Okay, so he was working with the singer during rehearsal and improving the music, which he does quite often in other operas as well. So I want to close this talk by mentioning a few highlights from the opera to listen out for in this evening's performance. Deidamia is the strongest character in the opera and who expresses perhaps the most emotion. Consequently, her music, written for the singer La Francesina, is also some of the best in the opera, and it is clear that Handel was writing for an experienced performer who was well known to him. In Act 1, the musical characterization of Deidamia is fairly light, and Handel generally depicts her as being carefree and in love, despite her foreboding fears for what lies ahead. The final aria of the act embodies this, in which she sings of the nightingale hiding from the dangers in her nest, set in the warm key of A major with a quick tempo and imitation of bird song in the violin part. In contrast, in Act 2, Her first aria, Se il ti amore, found in scene 3, displays an almost immediate change in her demeanour. Now, in a slow tempo in the key of F sharp minor, the relative minor key of her previous aria, she expresses her despair at the thought of losing Achilles. We can listen to a few bars of each aria so you can hear the change in mood between Act 1 and Act 2. Okay, throughout the opera, Deidamia is in love with Achilles, but she is afraid of losing him, and at the same time she is exasperated by his behaviour. The slow aria in G minor, Va perfido, in Act 2, Scene 9, expresses this sentiment with unpredictable moments of silence, coupled with adagio passages for the words "a barbaro," "a barbarian." So she's calling him a barbarian, and those words are highlighted, marked here in red, where the music slows down. So these are set to music in a way that sounds a little bit like sighs, highlighting the anguish and heartache behind Deidamia's anger at Achilles' betrayal. So this sounds a little bit like this. In other arias, Deidamia is also filled with grief as a result of Ulysses' deception, and expresses this in the emotional and what has been described as the most remarkable of her arias, Mahi Reza Infelice in Act 3, Scene 2, in which she curses Ulysses. Here, Händel depicts Deidamia's psychological state of conflicting thoughts, with a slow A section in which she sings of how Ulysses has been the cause of her ruin, followed by a fast, agitated B section to depict her anger towards him, where she calls him a barbarian and hopes that a raging storm on the sea plunges him into eternal night. This type of contrast is a typical device used by Händel and other opera composers for arias depicting emotions, such as love and anger. So love in the first half and then anger in the second half. And can see the switch in mentality. So we can hear a few bars of each section here so you can hear the contrast. So one of Händel's particular skills as a composer is the depiction of characters and their emotions through music. And as I hope these very short examples show, give you an example of the way he treats Deidamia musically have shown. In today's performance, do try and listen to the way the music changes or stays the same throughout the opera for each character. So try and listen to each individual character on stage and how the music changes throughout the opera, because that often tells you a lot about the way Handel saw that particular person. And sometimes it can give you an indication of what might happen if they suddenly become sad or particularly happy or something like that. So, with only 3 performances of Deidamia, it was not the most successful of Handel's operas, and it was never revived by Handel following the 1740-41 season. For the following season, Handel was in Dublin, where he gave the first performance of Messiah at Neil's Music Hall. And upon his return to London, for the 1742-3 season, he concentrated on English oratorios for the remainder of his career until his death in 1759. Deidamia was not revived until 1953 when it was performed at Halle as part of the Händel-Festspiele there, and please do go to Halle to the next Händel-Festspiele when you're finished here in Göttingen. So I hope you enjoy the performance tonight. Thank you for listening. Have fun, and maybe I'll see you again sometime. Thank you.